Hey everybody, Brant Frost. Hope y'all are doing well. I'm joined today by Suzi Voyles, a dear friend of mine. She is the Assistant Secretary of the Georgia Republican Party, and she is running for Secretary of the party in this upcoming convention in just a few days. I wanted to have her on. Suzi, we're probably going to see 30% or more of the delegates be first-time attenders. So it's really important that they get to know the candidates because probably have no knowledge of any of the candidates other than just seeing a name. So I wanted to talk with you and give you a chance to introduce yourself to them. But mainly, I wanted to save you time. And the Bible says, let another man praise you, not your own lips. I'll tell you, folks, Suzi has been such an amazing volunteer for decades. She volunteered on President Reagan's campaign, served in so many wonderful volunteer capacities, was president of Eagle Forum here in Georgia, which is a group established 50 years ago to stop basically the original LGBT left wing revolution back in the 1970s, and was successful in stopping it back in those days. And now Suzi has served for many years in elections in Fulton County. Election integrity is the top issue in most voters' minds in our party. And Suzi actually went to bat. Suzi, tell them about how you went to testify before the Senate in 2020, right after the election. And we were there together. We were in the House Appropriations room. All these witnesses were sitting there. I was sitting up front, keeping the list and, queuing up the next witness to go in. We had pizza ordered in there. I remember we took pictures. Tell them about that day and what transpired. It was on national news.
it, it was kind of an interesting day. First of all, I was really honored to have been called in by Senator Ligon to testify on behalf of what I had seen. I was a 25-year poll manager, and so doing that, I had a bit of experience in elections and things that I saw. And prior to the 2020 election, and I've been to five secretaries of state, starting back with Kathy Cox. Actually, I think I started with Max Cleland speaking on um, what I had seen in Fulton County. And I just thought it was Fulton County that was having problems. And to shorten the story a little bit, we switched from debold machines to the Dominion machines. And in full disclosure, I do have a cease and desist from Dominion, not to talk about them, but unfortunately, the truth is the truth. And one of the things I did as a poll manager is I was sworn to ensure that the election was free of fraud, abuse, and um, and they put the word waste, but of course we didn't waste anything during the election, and in the continuance thereof. It was in the continuance thereof when we were counting these ballots that things became like little sirens going off, and I put my hands. When you've done this for a long time, you even know how the paper feels, and the paper felt different, and there were no folds in the paper. In this one particular batch, rather than having 100 in them, it had 110. Out of the 110, 107 of them were marked for Joseph R. Biden, two were marked for Donald J. Trump, and one was marked for um, Jorgensen. The thing that was unique about them, though, it wasn't just those presidential ballots that were identical. And there was a small eclipse in the printings of every mark for Joseph R. Biden. There was a long column to replace Johnny Isakson, who had resigned because he had Parkinson's disease. And Republicans, Democrats, everybody was in that column. On those 107 ballots, every single one was marked for Ossoff. That caused me to look at all the other races on those 107 ballots. And, statistics are a funny thing. You might have two people who vote exactly alike, but when you have 107 who are voting alike, from the presidential candidate all the way down to Fulton Soil and Conservation, including all the amendments that most people don't even pay attention to, you begin to say, there's something awry here. And so I talked to my partner, there were two of us at a table adjudicating these ballots, and she was a longtime poll manager also, and she agreed there was something that just didn't seem right. And so we made our report, and we were told, no problem. Well, miraculously, in the middle of the night, when we left at close to 7 o'clock that night, we'd been there since 6 in the morning. There were pallets of these ballots, and we were told to be back the next morning at 8 o'clock. So we dutifully went back the next morning, and somehow, miraculously, when nobody else was in the building, all of these pallets of ballots had disappeared. So I was asked to write an affidavit, and I thought about it and I prayed about it. And I finally called this particular attorney back and I said, I'll write the affidavit. And he was a very capable attorney. So the affidavit, he knew what questions to ask to guide me down through my affidavit. And so things would flow well. And then when I was all done, he said, is there any more to your testimony? And I said, just one thing. I'd like to add at the end that I'm sure if this goes forward, I will be fired from Fulton County elections and not allowed to ever work again. And that turned out to be the truth, not only for me, but for Bridget Thorne. And we never would have met each other had they not fired us. The interesting thing about that is she was the one who thought she was calibrating the machines, making sure that the marks went into the right place and things like that. She never expected ballots to get into the queue of ballots that needed to be adjudicated. Likewise, those are the ballots I found. My seals were not done properly. Every seal has a Secretary of State seal on it. That set me on my quest. So when I gave my testimony before Senator Ligon's commission, and this was the first committee that I had spoken with, I was asked a lot of questions. And one of the interesting questions was, well, what happened the day of voting? And I said, well, I'm glad you asked because this wasn't in my affidavit, but the day of voting, and by the way, this later became part of another affidavit in another court case, the express polls were not programmed properly. I was at a poll in Sandy Springs. They were programmed 23 miles away for Adams Park Library, which is around 285 and I-20, roughly, it was quite a way. And it took me a while to realize they weren't sending the people there. The poll pad thought that's where the people were. And it was sending them up to our poll. But the way our poll was programmed, they couldn't vote because it was programmed for Adams Park Library. So I called our techs. The techs came in, and you know how when you make a phone call, you see, if I called you Brant, I would see Brant Frost 4 on mine, 5 on mine, I'm sorry. And I would see that on my phone. And the thing that was interesting, these people called Dominion. I explained the problem. Dominion was in Colorado. And what happened was they reprogrammed them remotely, which proved they were connected to the internet and that things were, we were told they weren't connected to the internet, but they were. We were also told to use any opportunity that we could to use any BMD, the ballot marking device. Those are the big machines. But I had been trained earlier, if a machine seals are broken, you never use those. So this man in the committee, and I won't reveal his name, but he was a state senator, said, how do you know they called Dominion? And, sometimes the Lord just gives you the right words and the right answer. And I said, well, if my power's out and I call the number that says Georgia Power, I said, I'm assuming the person on the other end that takes my report is Georgia Power. I said, likewise, this was the number in our manual. But I said, that's not the point. The point is that they were able to fix my problem remotely on the internet. Anyway, that led to a long quest where, fortunately, my testimony was not only honest, but it was credible to those who were listening to it. So I had the privilege and honor over this 4-year period, and it hasn't stopped, of not only testifying on behalf of things with our state and participating in our election integrity committee for the Georgia Republican Party, and we've chipped away to add and add and add more securities that have been codified into law here, and we still
Exactly.
have more to go. But that is that's kind of the story, the Cliff Notes.
And did they ever find out why they could remotely service and correct the problems in those machines? Did they ever explain how that could be done?
I, if they, if you're assuming that's either Fulton County elections or Dominion, I believe
Yes.
that's why I got my cease and desist order because
Interesting.
and I still have it in the FedEx that it arrived in because it's not that I'm ignoring it, but there are times when the truth triumphs any penalty that I might receive.
And
Or,
to this day, Fulton County has not explained why that was the case. They haven't said, "Oh, well, we plugged it into a modem or something because we wanted it repaired, but we don't usually do this." They, to this day, they've not explained themselves, been able to explain how that was possible.
well, not only did they not explain it, but they didn't do anything other than call Dominion, and then it was remotely done. The techs who were there did nothing. My assistant manager was sitting at the poll just watching it change from Adams Park Library to Spalding Drive Elementary School.
Yeah. Well, if that was something that was not if there was nothing wrong with what they were doing, you would think they would have been able to fairly easily explain what was going on. They should have been able to say something like, "Well, we don't usually these things aren't connected to the internet usually, but if you do these sort of things, if the poll manager does these sort of things and connects it to Wi-Fi or whatever, then we can access it remotely, but only in those situations. Otherwise, you can't do it." But if it what they were doing wasn't if there wasn't something wrong or illegal in what they were doing, it should have been easy to explain. But they're to this day, the fact they haven't been able to come up with an explanation, which should be if it's honest, it should be a simple explanation, is a very telling.
Yes, it should be. And I went a little bit further. You mentioned that I am the president of Eagle Forum. And one of the things I did, I called up two of my women that I knew were not poll workers.
Mhm.
And I said, I need you to do me a favor. I need you to go to these 25 polls in North Fulton County. I chose something that was geographically convenient for them.
Mhm.
And so they split it up and they went. And I said, I want you to get into the parking lot and I want you to turn off the Wi-Fi on your phone. And I said, wait 20 seconds and then turn it back on and take a screenshot of all of the Wi-Fis that pop up.
Mm.
Interestingly, um, that produced some rather, to me, alarming information because there were these white vans that were outside, not the Fulton County vans, just other white vans. And this was a concerted effort to
And
play,
what
in essence, a
happened?
walnut game.
Wi-Fi. Yeah, with what in the Wi-Fi? What happened when they turned the Wi-Fi on? What Wi-Fi did they see that it looked interesting?
I'd have to go back, but the fact that it was at all these different facilities and you could see, for example, where I was, Spalding Drive, it said, and I just don't want to give you misinformation, but it would say
Sure.
Spalding Drive Elementary, Administrator Spalding Drive Elementary, and most of them would be school Wi-Fi's. And then there was this additional Wi-Fi that was identical at every polling place. And so my little experiment, well,
Interesting.
it was.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. And so fast forwarding now for the benefit of our new delegates to 2023, when you 2 years ago, when you ran for assistant secretary of the state party and were elected, you won, if I remember right, you had the largest margin of any candidate. You won 80% of the vote. And I remember the loudest cheers. You received the loudest cheers of anyone there. because when you talked about this and what you had done in Fulton County, they gave you cheers and loudest cheers and standing ovation. And like I said, you won by a margin of 1,051 votes out of less than 1,600 delegates voting. You won by a margin of over 1,000 votes with 80.2% of the vote. I think that's the largest recorded vote share that any candidate has won since I've been coming to convention. In fact, no, it is. Since I've been coming to conventions in the late 2000s, since 2009, you had the widest margin, largest margin, biggest share of the vote of any candidate
I
that
was very
has.
humbled. I was, that's the only word I can use. I worked hard to win, but I was humbled, um, and honored to have received that kind of vote.
And this year, in 2024, you served on the National Platform Committee. You were a national delegate to the Republican National Convention for President Trump. You were an elector, one of our 16 Republican electors in 2024 that cast an electoral vote for President Trump. And you served as one of the 8 committee members, each delegation, for the benefit of folks, each delegation from each state and territory to the Republican National Convention gets to pick 4 of their delegates, 4 men and 4 women, as members of committees: the Platform Committee, the Rules Committee, the Business Committee, and the Credentials Committee, the Permanent Business and Arrangements Committee, and the Credentials Committee. And usually the committee that gets the most attention is the Resolutions Committee, the Platform Committee, because it's usually live streamed on C-SPAN. It's a multiple day period. You can go back and watch on C-SPAN hours and hours of committee business. It's surprisingly an open affair in that members can make amendments during committee process, and sometimes the amendments pass. Sometimes they fail, but it was fairly open until this year. This year they wrote it all in advance, approved it on a pretty much a take it or leave it vote. But here's the thing: they basically took out a lot of historic conservative and pro-family traditional positions, unfortunately, in it, and only a handful of members of the committee were willing to vote no to this very un-Republican process and stripping away these conservative things. Only about 20 some odd members, including Chairman McCoon, who was on the committee as a committee man, and you, Suzi, as a committee woman, were willing to vote against that running roughshod over the delegates' preferences. So I really think that folks would be very much appreciative of what you did on that and hearing more about that.
Well, that was really an honor, and it was very unusual. And I think one of the things is, there's a difference between a candidate's stance and a candidate's platform, so to speak, and the party's platform. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion came in with a lot of the new people. And it wasn't Rhino establishment versus MAGA. It wasn't that at all. But a platform articulates who we are, what we believe. And, many of us become frustrated with our local elected officials or our legislators or here in the state or wherever they are, federal. But if we don't say, this is what a Republican is, this is who a Republican is, these are our core values, if we don't spell that out, then that makes it very hard for them to know exactly how to vote as a Republican, for example. And so I was privileged to be on there. It was a tad bit different when we got there the next morning. Typically, you meet rapidly on a Sunday. And then on Monday, you're supposed to split up into your committees. And there were supposed to be 6 committees of the platform. And everything from, let's say, family to Second Amendment, foreign relations, et cetera, et cetera. And each committee would tackle their portion and then come back together either the end of the second day or the third day to smush everything together into one cohesive document. But when we got there, we had to pass by a table and we had to turn in our phones and put it into a locked Faraday bag, which means I couldn't call out. No one could call me in. No one could listen, which there was no reason for me to do that, but in case there were press there. And if you had an Apple Watch or a smartwatch of some kind, you had to put that in the Faraday bag. And they allowed us to have that at our place, but we weren't even handed a platform yet. And then we were locked in the room. And at first I'm thinking, oh, my stars, even when I needed to go to the ladies' room after a couple hours, I needed someone to walk with me and make sure I was only taking care of my prescribed business in the ladies' room. And I'm thinking,
And
I'm going.
they were doing all this just because they were afraid that they might not be able to get you to do exactly what they wanted you to do. They wanted to keep such control over this. It's just crazy.
Oh, I think they didn't want anybody to leak what was going on.
Yeah.
But we were handed the proposed platform, and it was Xeroxed. Each of us had a little number on ours. My number was 23. And the reason they put the numbers on them was because if somehow I could magically blink my eyes and take a picture of them,
Yeah.
they would know that was my document. But the disappointing thing for me is there were three areas that I would have liked to have seen stronger. And of course, one of them was protections for the unborn. Another one was Second Amendment, I felt was, I don't want to say watered down, but it was diminished a bit. And it was more popular language than just straightforward language that we need to protect our Second Amendment. And then the other one, this was right after so many things had happened on the campuses with
Mhm.
anti-Semitic
Mhm.
actions happening against our students and particularly Jewish students. We needed to make a statement, a strong statement on Israel and on anti-Semitism. And because we sort of glossed over that, I don't think it really clearly told what our heart is, where our heart is, and who we are. And it made it more squishy for those who are proposing policy and legislation.
Basically, someone in the RNC leadership hierarchy or the Trump campaign wrote this document and then presented it to you and said, this is what you're going to vote on. Presented it to all of you. Someone in the RNC swamp wrote this document and then says, here you go, you're voting on this. And keep in mind, this has never happened before. The platform committee has, since C-SPAN was created, has always met publicly. It has always been live streamed, and committees have had a lot of latitude. And this is the first time this has ever happened. Now, fast forward to now, and also when I was on the rules committee at that same convention with you, we had a similar situation. However, what happened to y'all was so infuriating to other committee members that I actually, I and a few others raised a fuss in the rules committee about, are you going to try to take away our phones too? And they would have, I was told later, they would have, had it not been for the fact that all the fuss that we made, a few of us made. But again, in the Rules Committee, we proposed an amendment. I offered a motion to remove secret ballots from RNC elections. I said National Committee members should not hide who they voted for chairman of the party. That motion was introduced. If that committee had been allowed to vote its conscience, it would have passed easily. But because the RNC had made a deal that no changes would be made, and the Trump campaign said yes, that motion was defeated by a vote of about 80 to 25. Now, keep in mind, in the Credentials Committee, the Missouri delegation was in dispute, and a MAGA slate versus a not so MAGA slate was in contention. The Credentials Committee had no oversight from the Trump campaign or the RNC. The Trump campaign said, just do whatever. It's fine. And that committee voted unanimously to seat the more grassroots MAGA slate. So we saw in the Credentials Committee what would have happened in the Rules and Platform Committee had the process been allowed to play out. We would have had an even more grassroots, even more pro-MAGA position had we been allowed to. So So that in reality, them trying to hold the thumb down and making a deal with the RNC was not a good deal for them. But it all worked out in the end because J.D. Vance is now our vice president and likely our next nominee. And I'm very confident that he will straighten out a lot of this stuff. And but finally, just to wrap up, you, Suzi, is a great example of the difference. You, after that convention, started thinking about how can we rectify this? And now in our Georgia convention, and coming up in just a few days, our platform, which is one page plus legislative priorities, has been expanded. The committee you chair has expanded the platform to cover the issues that were being left out at the national level and to more properly represent our conservative grassroots. And now we're going to have the first ever detailed platform in the history of the Georgia Republican Party, thanks to your work. And I really think folks should take note of that. The chairman of the committee is vital in our committee process in the Georgia Republican Party. If the chairman wants something or doesn't want something, the chairman has all kinds of means by which to block something. So the fact that we have the most full and conservative platform we've ever had, and the fact that we have some resolutions, including some resolutions dealing with elected officials who need to be dealt with, there's a lot of credit. And when you're looking for someone to vote for and say, well, who's willing to stand up for us? Who's willing to stand up to the politicians or whatever? Just remember that Suzi was chair of the committee, which passed the most bold report we've ever seen. And we would not have had that report if it wasn't for her. So I hope you'll join me. And, I've never told in any of these interviews, I've never said who I was going to vote for. But this is the one case where I'll make the exception. I am going to vote for Suzi, and I hope you will too.
That's very kind. If I can say something, though, that was not an effort just of my own. It was
unanimous.
Good teamwork.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Suzi, and God bless you. We'll see you this Thursday.
Thank you. Drive carefully, everybody.